The Terror at Night. For the 10th time that day, in a voice that shook somewhat, Martha Hosley read aloud the item in the Mayfield Weekly Gazette. The real estate firm of Seeley and Seeley today announced that it is placing on sale the old Hasley house. The house owned by Miss Martha Hasley is located directly opposite the courthouse. The New England wind tore through the ivy-hung eaves of the old house, so remote from the noise of the bustling city. The wind seemed to give a shriek of glee. Everything had gone wrong, but yet the wind was laughing at the house. Martha's blue-veined hands still held the paper, although her eyes did not see the print. She was musing over the incidents that had led to the selling of the old house. How had it all begun? The newspaper slipped from her hands and fell to the floor at the side of her wheelchair. Martha was deep in thought. Her eyes were blank and had a glassy appearance. Her thoughts were terrifying and almost unbelievable. Martha would never have believed it. A nightmare, perhaps. No, the incidents were real and now over. Why must she keep remembering? She remembered how it all began. The nurse. It had all started when the nurse arrived. The other nurse had had to leave. Something about a sick cousin. Martha shuddered as she thought about the new nurse. She was very big and had the features of a man. Those hands Martha tried to push out of her mind. How those very hands had almost ended her life. The nurse had arrived on the bleak November afternoon. Martha remembered how it had rained all that day. She remembered opening the door to find the nurse standing on the porch. The nurse's hair was plastered to her face, giving an uncanny appearance. Martha had explained to the nurse that the upstairs was not being used. She could not manage all of the stairs with a wheelchair. There was an old elevator, but it was so creaky that it had not been used for years. There was no need, Martha had told the nurse, for her to go upstairs. All of the rooms were locked. Martha did not have many friends. There were seldom any visitors, and the telephone rarely rang. As soon as the nurse arrived, the phone rang constantly. The calls were always for the nurse. Martha had not thought much about the calls at first, but then she began to wonder. One day, Martha had picked up the extension and heard the nurse's voice on the other end. Martha started to put the phone down, but had a sudden urge to listen. It was a man's voice on the other end. The nurse was saying, "I think that I almost have her trusting me. She's a weird old coot. She's always asking me about this and that, and never fails. Every day she tells me not to go upstairs. Maybe she has a body up there in one of those rooms." Martha had let the phone slide from her hand to the floor. She stood motionless in a stupor. The nurse had heard the noise, but had figured it had been a bad connection. Martha regained control of herself. She did not ask the nurse about the call. That night in bed, Martha restlessly tossed and turned. Why had the nurse said that about a body? Maybe she had been too persistent about the locked rooms. The wind was howling and the shutters were hitting against the house. The rain splattered against the window. Martha did not hear the rain, as she had finally fallen asleep. Martha suddenly jerked and sat up in bed. She had heard something. Had it been her imagination? No, she distinctly heard some strange sound. It was coming from the room right above her. But those rooms were all locked. No one could possibly be in that room. The sound was becoming louder. It sounded as if someone was dragging a chain across the floor. Martha knew she could not stand it much longer. As quickly as the noise began, it quit. The whole house was now silent. Martha was badly shaken. She could not get back to sleep, and arose with the sun the next morning. She was going to make a point of asking the nurse about the noise. The nurse replied that she had slept very well and nothing had disturbed her. Was the nurse lying? But why would she lie? That night, and every night for a week, Martha was awakened. The sounds varied from night to night. She heard a piano playing very loudly. She heard footsteps and voices. Every night the sound came from the room above. Every night Martha became more terrified. How much longer would she be tormented? The 7th night she awoke to see a shadow on the wall. It was a man's shadow. Martha was horrified. She wanted to scream, but all she could do was stare. The shadow disappeared. Martha's door had been locked from the inside. The next night the shadow appeared again, but this time it spoke. "Martha, Martha, don't be afraid. You thought that you were rid of me forever. Ha!" The shadow gave another haunting laugh and disappeared. Martha sat in a daze. She fell back in a faint. When she regained consciousness, the nurse was standing over her. Had Martha imagined it, or was there a slight grin on the nurse's face? That day Martha sat and stared into space. Terence was back. Was she becoming insane? How could Terence be back? He was dead. Dead! The next night, Martha heard a tapping at her wall. It seemed to be coming from behind the wall. Then the shadow appeared, only this time it was wearing a rope around its neck. It let out a terrifying shriek, clutched its throat, and disappeared. Martha could not stand it another night. The next morning she tapped against the walls. She was listening for a hollow sound. Maybe there was a hidden panel. She found nothing. "If only I could get upstairs, I'd find out where those noises are coming from," Martha said out loud. The elevator, she thought. It was her only chance. She wheeled to the elevator. Would the ropes hold her weight? She would soon find out. She pushed the lever and slowly ascended. She could hear the chains grinding. The creaks were nerve-straining. She reached the second floor and pushed the lever to open the door. It was jammed. How much longer would the chains hold out? Martha pulled and the door slowly opened. She wheeled out. Her heart was pounding heavily. The excitement was too much for her. Suddenly there was a horrifying clatter. She turned herself around to see the ropes give way. The elevator was gone. As it hit the ground, it shook the entire house. Windows rattled and shutters banged, while Martha sat trembling. The only important thing was now to reach the room. She turned the knob. It was unlocked. The door creaked open. A musty odor met Martha. Yes, there definitely had been someone there. She could see slight imprints on the carpet. Martha had a feeling creeping over her, as if there was someone else in the room. She wheeled around to see the nurse in the doorway. The nurse moved into the room and made a lunge for Martha. Martha wheeled forward with all her strength. The nurse fell and Martha wheeled out of the room. She saw Martha near the stairs, and the nurse made another lunge. The nurse, standing in front of Martha, had her hands around Martha's throat. Martha gave one last try. She pushed with all her might. It caught the nurse off guard. The nurse tried to regain her balance. Martha gave another shove, and the nurse crashed through the banister. Martha heard the scream as she fell. Martha sat motionless. Tears began flowing down her cheeks. She could now cry. The cry that was so long ago needed. She knew she would have to call the police. She must hurry. The man might return at any time. She found a phone in the hall. Now, all she had to do was wait. What would the man do to her if he returned? The one working with the nurse. She heard the door open and could hear footsteps coming up the stairs. Oh, please let it be the police, Martha prayed. The first thing she saw was the gold badge. One policeman had a man handcuffed in front of him. The man confessed to everything. The nurse had discovered the body hanging in the room upstairs. It was the man who decided to drive Martha insane. They had found the secret panels, which had greatly aided their plan. The man was a distant cousin and hoped to gain money from Martha's death. They had planned that very night to kill her. The police wanted to know about the body. Martha told the police that Terence was her brother. Martha's father had tormented him so that he had driven her brother to suicide. Martha and her father had said nothing, so that there would be no scandal. Her father had died soon after. Martha had made sure all the rooms were locked and had said that her brother had left. It was all out in the open now. There would be scandal, but at the moment, Martha did not care.